Okay, good evening everyone. I'd like to introduce you to Tom Lockley from the Aviation Historical Society of New South Wales. He's going to give us a presentation on Luigi Pellarini and his aircraft. Over to you, Tom.
Thanks very much, Peter. And before I begin, thanks for your work in recording all these Zoom meetings of the early stages. I think it will alter the way aviation history is looked on throughout the entire country. Anyway, this is just a recording of the first talk given on the internet from AHSA New South Wales, and as obvious, it deals with Luigi Pellarini. He burst on the scene in the 60s because of the AirTruck, which he produced in coordination with the Belgiano-Nettis family. On the left, we've got Luca Belgiano-Nettis. On the right, we've got Luigi Pellarini. And it's his story that I'm going to tell. He was born in 1913 to quite a wealthy Italian family. They had made lots of money by making industrial chimneys. They had a very distinguished group of names. There was Cesare, Augusto, Alessandro, and the sister was called Pompeo. And Luigi was the son of Alessandro, who was killed in the war. The family was well looked after by the other uncles and aunt, and he certainly came from quite a privileged background. After the war, I should just mention that they lived in France for quite a while, but after the war, he returned to Italy to study in the Istituto Tecnico Rossi, which was one of the colleges set up by Mussolini to bring Italy into the modern world. He started off as an electrical engineer and became interested in aircraft. And at the age of about 22 in 1935, he joined Servoio Marchetti, and I'll come back to that later on. Just a quick overview of the aircraft that he built. In Italy, these are all flying cars, and I'll talk about those in a moment. In Australia, he first produced what could be called the PL6, but is probably better known as the Fawcett 120. Then he went on to the various versions of the what became the Airtruck, and those are the aircraft that he designed, and the yellow ones actually flew. The most important one, of course, is the Airtruck of 1965, which we'll be talking quite a lot about. But as I mentioned, his first real job was working for Servoio Marchetti, and their glamour product of the time was the S-55 seaplane. And they were definitely leaders in seaplane field from the end of the First World War onwards. Francisco de Pinedo, for example, flew a Servoio aircraft in his flight around the world and came to Sydney in that. And of course, probably the most successful Italian aircraft of the war was the Spaviero 3-engine bomber, and he certainly would have been working on that. He was married in 1939 to a lady that he met while he was working for Servoio Marchetti. But he also worked for a few other firms. One of them was Simon. About 300 of these aircraft were produced. They were light aircraft trainers and so on. Unfortunately, there's not a good photograph, so I've got to rely on this drawing. But the main thing I'm interested in is the general shape of the Simon, which we'll see later on. He also worked for an interesting character by the name of Alberto Jona, and his firm Magni produced this incredible seaplane, sesquiplane at least, and instead of having ailerons, flaps, etc. on the wing, the whole wing tilted. So to bank, you would tilt the whole wing in whichever way you wanted to go. A bizarre idea. I don't think it's ever happened since, but certainly the aircraft survived until 1943. It sort of got lost in the chaos after the war. So as well as being in the mainstream aircraft, he's always interested in oddbods. But his main reputation in Italy was made by flying cars. This is the only picture of the AER-1. Here we're going straight to the AER-5, and you can see that the wings are being unfolded at this stage. Look, would you please Google Italian flying car 1949 and watch a Pathé pictorial newsreel of Pellerini's Aerauto. The link is there, but it's the YouTube link is there, but it's pretty complicated. So just Google that and you'll find that you'll get a very interesting 2-minute film on the aircraft. This is the final version, the PL5, which you'll see in the newsreel. You can see it's quite nicely set up as a car, and the performance claim for it was pretty extreme. I'll just go back to the previous slide. The road speed claimed was 120 miles an hour, nearly 200 kilometres an hour. The airspeed that was claimed as 200 miles an hour, 320 kilometres an hour. Seems a bit of a big ask from an 85 kilowatt engine. But the terrifying thing is that the motive power for the aircraft was the propeller itself. So you can imagine tearing along the roads at 120 miles an hour and having to stop in rather a hurry. It would not be a good scene to be in. Anyway, he made a total of 5 different aircraft. The last one made a tour of Italy on road and in air that created a lot of interest worldwide, as you'll see in the movie, but for some reason it didn't sell. And Luigi started looking for other opportunities. And strangely enough, he landed up in Australia. Just a picture of the AR-5, quite an elegant looking thing, but again, a frightening thing to see on the road at 120 miles an hour, I think. This is the patent for the folding wing, which eventually he was granted in 1954. The idea was that the wings would wrap around the propeller so that pedestrians wouldn't get chopped up in the propeller, but it didn't work very well. Okay, so after finishing making flying cars in Italy, he cast around for another job, and strangely enough, he came to Australia. And he started work for Doug Fawcett in Bankstown. And I haven't been able to find a good photograph of Doug. So I've put in a photograph of this DC-5 aircraft. And Doug himself was a fascinating character, quite different from Luigi. He came from a rather impoverished background. His mother had a cafe at the site of Mascot Airport. He was always a bit of a go-getter, and from the age of about 10, he used to have a tray of sweets and chocolates and things that he took around the people who would come out to Mascot to look at the aircraft in the early 30s. During the war, I should mention that he actually left school at the age of 14 and started working on aircraft. And he's a remarkably talented engineer. And during the war, he had all sorts of adventures in the Pacific, repairing aircraft, and his memoirs are quite remarkable. I've chosen this picture to illustrate something interesting. It's a DC-5. It was virtually found in scrap form. They only made about 6 or 8 DC-5s throughout the world. And Doug Fawcett was instrumental in doing it up and getting it flying after the war. It belonged to A&A for a while. And eventually it was sold to the Israeli Air Force, which was then a clandestine operation and flown to Israel. Doug was amazing the way that he could find deals, and one of the things that happened to him was that he acquired Illawarra Flying School in payment for a debt. So he acquired a couple of aircraft and ran a very successful flying school. His adventures would take a whole evening to talk about, so I'm just going to move on and mention that the first thing that Pellarini did for Fawcett was to design the Fawcett 120. At the time, there were import restrictions on American aircraft, and the idea was that it would be an aircraft that he would use at the Illawarra Flying School for training. And it's a perfectly orthodox aircraft. Its detractors say it's copied from a Cessna at the same time, but it isn't. I mean, there's a typical Cessna of the time, tail wheel, heavy looking thing. The Fawcett was quite a nice aircraft. One copy was built, and we'll mention a bit about that later on. But his main interest was in developing an agricultural aircraft, and this was his first attempt, the PL7 of 1956, which was sponsored by Kingsford Smith Air Services at Bankstown. And they have absolutely nothing to do with Kingsford Smith. It was the Brown brothers that ran the show, and they sponsored Luigi Pellarini to build this agricultural aircraft with a cheetah engine from the engines that were used in Aerautos during the war. And it flew quite well. Keith Roby flew it and wrote it up for aircraft and said it was just like a tiger moth. I think he might have been being very kind to it, but certainly it worked well. One thing that was really good about that design for spreading fertilizer is the way that you have a lovely vortex from each of the wings, and the wings are shaped to give that special vortex, and the bottom wing of the sesquiplane configuration. So it was a very good fertilizer spreader. Another thing that he got involved in was this huge agricultural aircraft, a Bristol freighter, carried about 5 tons of superphosphate dumped in the top. The report said it was beautifully engineered and flew well. It did crash after 13 months, but that was put down to pilot error rather than failure of the aircraft. The PL8 is another aircraft that he designed, a rather large passenger aircraft, never finished, but this remainder of it is at Queensland Aviation Museum. There's the drawing of the PL8, and I'd just like to mention the researchers that are done at Queensland Aviation Museum, and particularly the work done by Ian Renford and others on the career of Pellarini. I'm not doing it justice. I'm skimming over many interesting things that they've found, and it's a remarkable body of work that they do, and the Pellarini paper is really remarkable, so I can thoroughly recommend it. The next thing he got involved in was the production of the Victor R2 for Mervyn Victor Richardson, the famous Australian who invented the rotary lawnmower, and always had an interest in aircraft. So he asked Pellarini to design him a suitable aircraft, and he asked Henry Millicer to design him a suitable aircraft, which of course passed into Australian legend as the Victor Air Tourer. Only one copy of the R2 was made. It was quite satisfactory, and interestingly, it's being restored to static display condition at the Haas Museum in Wollongong. It flew quite well, but the simpler Air Tourer got the Guernsey. So the next attempt at making an agricultural aircraft was more sophisticated, and it was done in New Zealand with a character rather like Fawcett called Snow Bennett, a person who took lots of risks in his industrial career. And this is the aircraft that Pellarini designed for him. The differences between this and its predecessor were largely the position of the pilot in the in the previous aircraft, the pilot was sort of down here, so that if the aircraft crashed, the pilot would be crushed with the engine. It's a rather odd aircraft, as you can see. When they run a competition for the ugliest aircraft in the world, it usually wins. And the reason why is because it was made up of parts from Harvards that were scrapped at the end of the war. And Snow Bennett bought all these and a lot more. And so you had Pratt & Whitney engines, and the canopies were used. And the interesting thing here is that Pellarini designed a innovative and great aircraft, but he never was able to continue with the factory working on the aircraft because he kept on changing things, and he wasn't oriented towards producing an aircraft. He was a brilliant designer, and by all descriptions of his work, he came up with some amazing solutions to engineering problems that always worked. But he was very difficult to work with, being a perfectionist. And in the end, the development of the AirTruck was taken over by other people in New Zealand. I haven't got time to go into that, but look for this movie on the internet and have a look at it. It's absolutely remarkable. Okay, so what happened in New Zealand? Jack Worthington crashed the first prototype. Another firm took over. Jeff Young, the designer who followed Pellarini and is actually recognised as the designer of the aircraft by Jane's All the World's Aircraft, left, and a second prototype was built and leased to Rural Aviation, and this is important, and then to Barr Brothers, but it did crash and the pilot was killed, and because of a rural depression, the project was not continued. So here we come to the picture that we started off with. We've got Luca Belgiorno Nettis, and we've got Luigi Pellarini announcing in Australia the construction of the AirTruck. The New Zealand aircraft was called AirTruck, T-R-U-C-K. Snow Bennett had a copyright on it, so this one was called AirTruck, A-R-T-R-U-K. And this is at the announcement of the production of the aircraft. And at Seven Hills, they built quite a remarkable factory, airstrip. A lot of money was put into the process. Okay, so let's have a look at the two trucks, I'll do that again, the two AirTrucks, the PL11 and the PL12. Here we've got a heavy and powerful radial engine, which makes quite a bigger aircraft. The AirTruck was made with new parts, so it was a far more advanced aircraft. Interestingly, the wing loading was higher on the PL11 than on the PL12. And look at the weights. Not quite twice as heavy in fully loaded condition as the PL11. Quite a neat little truck. We'll see this one later on VHTRN. It was actually the second aircraft to be built. The first one was tested to destruction, and we'll come back to that aircraft later on, but interestingly, in fact, here it is. So I first got interested in the AirTruck because I do a lot of voluntary work at the Powerhouse Museum, which has just had a near-death experience and is now going to be preserved. And hanging from the roof was the second prototype transfilled truck, AirTruck. And I used to tell the children about the AirTruck and also mention the fact that Transfield made their money from the production of high tension wires across the state, which caused the power stations in Sydney to be obsolete. Instead of bringing the coal to Sydney and generating the power in Sydney, the power was generated on site and carried over transfilled power lines throughout the state. And Transfield, in the form of the Belgiano and Ettis family, were strong sponsors of the museum. They presented this aircraft, which, since, as you can see, has since been painted up nicely. And it took a prominent place in the transport hall of the museum. Now, once again, Luigi left after the aircraft was designed and even before the first prototype flew. It was his idea. It was a brilliant idea. The engineering was wonderful, but nobody could work with him. So the Transfield organisation brought in Gilbert Forrester, who was an expert in production. Interestingly, Barr Brothers and the New Zealanders became involved. So Neil Johnson was the test pilot, and the first sale of 5 aircraft went to Barr Brothers. And Belgiano and Ettis rejoiced. Here the Barr Brothers aircraft lined up to be taken off. And he announced plans for all sorts of things, including supersonic airliners, and in which Pellarini would be involved in the design. Well, a quick run through of the PL-12. You had various versions of it, including a weaponized bush ranger aircraft supplied to Thailand for keeping the natives under control. The Sky Farmer. Some were used for transport aircraft and aerial ambulances. Interestingly, a lot of the production was exported to countries that are listed there, New Zealand especially, South Africa, Kenya, Thailand, Malaysia, Denmark, Taiwan, China, and Yugoslavia. Now, 8 are still on the Australian VH register, but interestingly, a lot of those have been re-imported from overseas. Transavia was disappointed with the low proportion of Australian sales, and the enterprise was never profitable. One thing that they did was make aircraft to order, so you never sort of had a standing stock of aircraft that people could look at and maybe buy on the spot. Transfield was a partnership between the Belgiano and Ettis and the Salteri family. The Salteri family weren't happy with the losses of the aircraft arm of Transfield, and eventually a brawl broke out between the families, and the company was split, and the aircraft factory was folded in the early 90s, the last aircraft being made in 1993. They had a lot of interesting projects online at the time, but they were never done. Interesting Airtrucks. This one was the star of Mad Max, Beyond Thunderdome. Mad Max, the dystopian post-apocalyptic films, is characterised, as you know, by these weird vehicles. But the Transavia air truck was weird enough and didn't need any special treatment. A couple of air ambulances. This one is a genuine air ambulance. This one was given to Bankstown Aviation Museum at the end of the run. It was simply assembled from spare parts and has never flown, but it's in aerial ambulance configuration. As well as being involved in Airtrucks, Luigi still retained an involvement in Italian aviation. Transfield became the agent for the FN 333 Riviera. Only one copy was imported, and I've already talked about Mervyn Victor Richardson, but the point I'll make here is that in about this time, Australia had quite a strong aviation industry, and the entrepreneurs of the industry approached the government for support, and they even said that all they wanted was to play on an even playing field with the Americans. So you had the militia, Airtura, Yeoman, who were modifying Wacker trainers, Sasson, and Belgiorno Nettis, and they all approached the government seeking support for the aviation industry. And I think, to Australia's disgrace, they were not given it. And the result is that the aviation industry tended to die. Well, so much for the production of aircraft in Australia. Let's look at where the aircraft are now. The PL7, no traces of that are found. The R2 I've mentioned, whoops, I'll go back. Most of the New Zealand aircraft, all of the New Zealand aircraft disappeared. There are a few parts around. The Forster 120 was re-engined in 1989 with the Lycoming engine, and another attempt was made to sell it, but it never reached production stage. It's a pity. It's a lovely aircraft, and those who have flown it say that it flies beautifully. It's now at AHSA, and I believe they're going to get it flying again. Here's an aircraft that is participating in an air show in Denmark, and here we have VHTRH owned by Dave Durham of Bathurst Aviation. When I got in touch with him to ask about his aircraft, he waxed lyrical. He said that it was an absolutely wonderful aircraft, could be maintained by a blacksmith in a third world country if he could read the instruction manual. And very strongly made. While taking off, he hit broke through to a drainage pipe. The aircraft stood on its nose but didn't collapse. And he also was amazed by its maneuverability. And here's the story, which I'll read. The AirTruck is incredibly maneuverable. One farmer wanted me to spray a 5-acre lot of serrated tussock in a valley surrounded by high hills. Even a helicopter pilot had refused to do the job. I said I would do it on an hourly rate, not per acre, and the farmer agreed. He would otherwise have to ride in on a horse and carry all his equipment and even the water to mix the spray. The aircraft handled the job magnificently, and the farmer was delighted. So here are some survivors, one in Motat, Denmark, Serbia, and if I'm right, that's Queensland Aviation Museums. Luigi did other things apart from AirTrucks, and these included consultation work with Italian firms. He assisted Frati in changing from wooden metal construction to all metal construction in the early 1960s. And he had a design and consultancy enterprise called Dynaplane, which was closed in 1980, but this was the start of a new career for him. An Italian writer called Giorgio Evangelisti wrote a history of Italian aircraft design with a chapter on Pellarini. And he is amazed at Pellerini's ability to solve engineering problems and his vision. And in the book, we have a number of designs that Pellarini came up with after he retired. Certainly, he is in contact with firms like Northrop and Lockheed in America, and some of his designs were quite amazing. Here we've got a 3-level aircraft. Among other things, it's got the same sort of variable swept wings as the F-111. He had another attempt to produce a flying car. I'm not really impressed with this one. I don't think it was very practical. An interesting interlude occurred in 1976. Now, there was a rumor that in the early 60s, Luigi was advising Jack Brabham when he became road racing champion on his car's aerodynamics, shaping the cars to be held down on the road rather than to take off. And certainly there's a story in 1976 where Reg Brabham, Jack Brabham's cousin, had entered into partnership with Pellarini to build a delta wing 7-seater aircraft, and it was going to cost $120,000. They invested a couple of $100,000 into it, and the only photograph I can find of it is this one from a newspaper, and you can see the shape of the thing there. There is another photograph inside the factory at Girraween. Here we have a model, a flying model, and here we have a mock-up of the prototype. It didn't progress very far, despite the fact that the Brabham family gave it a lot of hype at the time. And Luigi went back to, or continued, I should say, designing. Notice the huge double-decker aircraft here. And I'm just going to mention the sort of signature of Pellerini's various designs. You can see that there are all sorts of common features among the 4 main aircraft that he designed here. Common wings, the sesquiplane layout, and so on. They're unique designs and distinctly appropriate to Pellarini. Here's the sort of light aircraft design, the R2 and the BL-13, which was never built, and BL-9. This one's fascinating. 3 fuselages in a biplane jet aircraft, powered by 80,000 pound static thrust engines, which hadn't been built at the time, but since have been. Still pretty frightening, but interesting concept. And Evangelista makes the point that the Rockwell X30 design looks as though it had Pellerini's influence in it. This was for a hypersonic scramjet aircraft that could fly from America to Australia in a matter of 6 or 8 hours, something like that. So that brings me to the end of the talk. I do think he's an absolutely remarkable person. He contributed a huge amount to Australian aircraft, and I'm really interested in finding out more about his work. There are still a lot of unanswered questions. So please feel free to email me with questions and corrections. And I do have a little book, which is virtually what I based this talk on. It is different from the Queensland Aviation Museum researchers because it has some pictures in it, but I strongly recommend the Queensland Aviation researchers and the film of the New Zealand Airtruck, to which I referred in the PowerPoint. So thanks very much for listening to me. That brings to the end AHSA NSW's very first essay into the digital world for its presentations. And once again, thank you, Peter. Back to you.
Thanks, Tom. Very, very interesting. A talk on a very interesting person and some very interesting historic aircrafts. Some of them, like the PL-11 and the PL-12, I wonder how the heck did they ever actually fly? They just look so weird. I have a bit of a connection with Transfield as well. I used to work in the power industry, so they built a lot of our transmission lines in Queensland, and I spent a bit of time visiting some of their construction camps. It was always a good time to be there at lunchtime, arrive at lunchtime, and had some vino for lunch. That was always good. So yes. Thanks very much, Tom. I'll end this